Welcome to my first book review of 2022, and it's a weird one to start with because we're looking backwards at the start of a new year, but we're looking back at the works of Junichiro Tanizaki. If you don't know who he was, Junichiro Tanizaki was one of the most prolific and celebrated and beloved Japanese authors of the 20th century. He brought us Some Prefer Nettles, The Makioka Sisters, A Cat, a Man and Two Women, and a bunch of other stuff I haven't read. This is a collection of 3 of his stories, newly translated by Anthony Chambers and Paul McCarthy and published by Columbia University Press. This is a very, very interesting selection of stories, and they have a unifying theme going on through them. All 3 of these stories are about a man's relationship to his mother in some way, or at least to his family, but mostly mother. I'm going to start talking about this in a weird place, which is at the end. At the very back of this book is a translator's note, which kind of serves as a little essay and a lot of background knowledge about Junichiro Tanizaki and the period of Japanese history that he lived through. It gives you a little bit of background into the political, religious, philosophical, ideological situation of Japan at that time, and it really helped me kind of understand and contextualize some of the events and even relationships and attitudes of the people in this book. So, if you pick this up, I really recommend reading the translator's notes at the end, because they really help with context. For example, the 3rd story in this collection, which is titled The Story of an Unhappy Mother, it primarily focuses on a young man's decision to prioritize the life and happiness of his new wife over that of his mother. And this translator's note at the back helped me understand the fact that in a very Confucian time period in Japanese history, that was a very unusual thing to do. And from our Western eye, our Western Christian perspective, whether you're Christian or not, you were raised in a Christian Western world, or at least I was. From our perspective, choosing to prioritize the life of your mother over your wife is a strange thing, but it's a very Confucian thing, and at this time in Japan it would have been expected. Therefore, this story is more shocking than it first appears, or at least it would have been to the people in Japan who read it when it was published. All of that out of the way, let's actually talk about these stories. As I already mentioned, this is a collection of 3 stories: Longing, Sorrows of a Heretic, and The Story of an Unhappy Mother. The 1st and 3rd stories are each about 30 pages long and are translated by Paul McCarthy. The middle story is a lot longer, it's about 70 pages long, and so it's translated by Anthony Chambers, meaning that they translated about the same amount each. What I love most about this collection, before I actually talk about what these stories are, is the fact that they celebrate or highlight how Junichiro Tanizaki himself celebrates storytelling. Each of these stories is a slightly different type of literature. Not hugely, but you can see that they have each been influenced by a different form. They're still recognizably his stories, but they come from a different place each, and they each deliver on the same kind of theme and topic. So it's very fascinating. He's got this obsession with a man's relationship to his family, as I said, primarily his mother, but he comes at it 3 different times through 3 different methods of storytelling. The first story, Longing, tells the story of a boy. It's narrated by him when he's a little bit older, you can tell because of the language that's being used. But it's about a boy who's walking down a road. He talks about how his family lost all of their money and ended up moving to the countryside, and right now, as the story begins, this kid who's like 5 years old is just walking down a country road, assuming this is his new neighborhood where he's moved to out in the sticks somewhere. But he's just wandering down this road. He ends up going into a kind of cabin, a small house, and he talks to this woman who at first he thinks is his mother, but she isn't. She's some other woman, and he refers to her as auntie or big sister. And the 2 of them have this weird and strained relationship. They don't know each other, they're strangers, and yet she starts talking about her kid, he starts talking about his mum, and it's almost as if they know each other, and then the story progresses from there. It's a dream. It's very obviously a piece of dream literature. I wouldn't call it a fever dream. It's not frightening and anxiety-inducing, and it's not that trippy. But there is a sense of fear and tension to it, as is the case with a lot of dreams. It is unsettling, but in a very, very quiet way, in little descriptions here and there of the scenery, descriptions of what the kid is feeling, descriptions of this woman that he meets. There's a tension in the air, and of course you've got a lost kid who is searching for his mum, effectively, or his home or something. And so of course there is tension, there is a foreboding atmosphere here, but it's not a horror story. It's a story of longing. This kid is looking for something. And there is not a twist ending, but an ending that kind of reveals the context of this dream that I found to be very satisfying. I loved the atmosphere of this tale in particular. I found it to be very textured. I found it rich and vibrant, even though it's very, very quiet. It takes place at night, and so it's muted. The mental image that you have is quiet. Crickets chirping, cicadas buzzing, that kind of a thing. But that adds a richness to the ambience, the sound quality almost of the environment. I was able to picture it so perfectly, despite it being a dream and therefore having some dream logic to it. It's a very satisfying atmosphere that Tanizaki creates with this story. The second story, Sorrows of a Heretic, is, as I said, the longest story here at 70 pages, and it is grounded in realism. Again, to reference the translator's note at the end, which is just so helpful when I was thinking about what to say in this review. This is a story that apparently is basically the most autobiographical thing that Tanizaki ever wrote, which is really, really cool. If you're a fan of Junichiro Tanizaki, if you're a fan of his works, his fiction, what you have here is kind of a confession of his youth. It's not entirely him, and the protagonist has a different name, and it is written in the third person, although it's entirely his perspective. So it is kind of an I-novel situation. It is hugely inspired by the events of his life, his opinions, his feelings, his failings most of all. Sorrows of a Heretic stars a kid called Shozaburo. Or perhaps kid isn't the right word, but it is. He's immature, he's naive, he's selfish, he's very damaged, he's not an adult by any means. But he is supposed to be about 25 years old and a university student. Shozaburo is living in a tenement building with his family. They're very poor, they're not doing very well. It talks about how his father originally married his mother, who has a decent amount of money, her family have money, so he marries well, and then over 20 years of marriage, he slowly just loses all of their money. He doesn't gamble it away, he doesn't drink it away, it just slowly disappears because he never made a success out of himself and out of the money that he was given. And so now they're a relatively poor family, and to make things much, much worse, Shozaburo has a little sister who is dying of what at the time was called consumption and what we now call tuberculosis. This girl will not live long. We know this right from the beginning. They say repeatedly that she has 1 or 2 months to live, and she and Shozaburo, despite that, do not get on. They're horrible to each other, they insult each other, they call each other idiots. Their relationship is strained, and he offers her no forgiveness, he offers her no kindness really, despite the fact that she's on death's door. This is an introspective and somber and pretty upsetting tale of youth mishandled. Shozaburo is not a nice kid, man, young man, whatever. He's not kind, he's not sweet. I can't give too much away because there's a pretty decent narrative arc to this 70-page story, but it really, really shifts into gear when Shozaburo receives a telegram that tells him that a friend of his, a friend from school, has died, and Shozaburo starts to think back to how he treated that friend and all of his mistakes. This is his relationship to his friends and his family, and it is a very difficult tale that is very honestly told about a young man being a failure of a person. He's arrogant, he's egotistical, he's probably depressed, and he's struggling, but he's not kind. It's complex. It's a story of family life and regret and difficult choices being made without much thought given to them. There's a lot going on, and it's probably the best story in here because of the honesty that is on display. The third story is perhaps the most interesting in terms of its narrative and the way that it's constructed. The story of an unhappy mother is told from the perspective of a son whose brother is the real protagonist here. Our narrator is pretty much just describing his brother's relationship to their mother. And the mother is a pretty unlikable person all the way through the story. She is obsessed with her children, providing her the attention and sentiment and love that she feels that she deserves. And again, as I said before, this is reflective of the age and what is expected of children. In spite of their age does not matter here. These people are all adults. Every character in here is at least 30 years old, and yet these men are expected by their mother to be completely subservient to her and satisfy her whims. This mother is a hypochondriac. She's terrified of everything, she's afraid of death, and she wants her sons to pity her and feel sorry for her at all times. And she's very unforgivable until you get to the end. And even more so once, as I said, I read the translator notes that gave a little context to this story. The main narrative of this is the fact that our narrator's brother is getting married, and he wants to get married to this young woman that he thinks is perfect for him. But he knows that his mother will say no because she didn't pick his bride. And so what he does is he constructs a situation where his mother will meet the bride and think, oh, she's great, she's a great fit, so she thinks she picked her son's wife. But she didn't. He already knew her, he already met her, he already wanted to marry her. And then from there, their relationship changes and shifts, and it gets more dark and tragic as it goes. By their relationship, I mean this son and his new wife, but also him and his mother. It's this Oedipal triangle going on, all the while our narrator is this guy's brother, just kind of observing. We get a little bit of information about his relationship to the mother and to his brother, but it's mainly him kind of observing, almost like the way that Watson observes Holmes' work. It's that kind of a narrator, and I think it was that choice of narrator that helped me enjoy this book so much, because it wasn't told in the first person. It wasn't your standard, this is what happened to me, this is my perspective. It feels slightly removed, but it's not in the third person either, where you've got this omniscient narrator. It is a person who exists within this world, telling a story from the inside, but not from the perspective of one of the two main characters, the son and mother. I really enjoyed that. I thought it was such a clever way to narrate and build this story. This is a fascinating collection. I love the fact that all three stories are about family relationships, mostly about mothers and sons. I find that really, really interesting. So there is a sense of cohesion here. They are all united by a theme, but as I said, they are each different types of literature. They are each different forms of narrative. And I love that. You've got this surreal-ish kind of dream narrative. You've got a very, very grounded autofiction confessional piece. And then you've got something that seems to be somewhere in between. I'm not exactly sure what you call it. It's a traditional short story narrative, but the focus versus the narration, the roles of the narrator and the protagonist, make it a very, very interesting read. I had a lot of fun reading this, and it was a really cool way to start 2022. As I mentioned in my last video, this was one of the most anticipated Japanese books of the year for me. It's my first read. I've started off on a very good note with a Japanese collection of stories. Junichiro Tanizaki himself. Really, really cool way to start the year. Awesome. Subscribe for books.